the topic of the talk today is production practice more effective than comprehension for second language? So, Elise, the floor is yours. Also, like, I want to tell you that this talk is recorded, and that I'm going to leave after 1 hour because I have another talk to give. So Elise is taking over as a host afterwards, and she will be happy to stay if you have more questions. All right, thanks, Elise, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Abdallah. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to give a talk at the seminar. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on this research. Can everybody hear me okay and see my slides? Great, okay. Yeah, so feel free to ask clarification questions during the talk. The talk will be about 45 minutes, but I'd prefer you save any other questions till the end of the talk. And like Abdallah said, I'm happy to stay past 4 o'clock, and I'm also happy to answer any questions via email. Okay, so production practice is more effective than comprehension for second language learning. But even though I study second language grammar learning, we're going to start today by thinking about learning a bit more generally, a bit more broadly. So I'm going to show you 2 clips, and I want you to think about which one you think constitutes a better learning experience. So in this clip, we see Ellen, who is the host of this show, and she's learning a new skill, a new laundry folding technique. And in this clip, you can see that she's learning by watching. So she's perceiving what the expert, Marie Kondo, is doing. And I'm going to think about this as learning through comprehension, through perception. Then contrast that with this other clip. So in this clip, Ellen is learning by doing. So she's getting hands-on practice, and she's producing specially folded language herself. And lots of things in life can be mastered better by trying to do them yourself and learning from that than by watching others do them. This holds for folding clothes, learning to play the violin, riding a bike. You don't learn those just by perceiving others doing them. But unfortunately, that same philosophy of practicing by doing hasn't always been popular for learning the grammar of a second language, which is my topic for today. In fact, traditional theories of second language acquisition and traditional classroom practice have been really focused on the comprehension side of things. So 2 popular theories in second language acquisition are called the input hypothesis and input processing theory. And they state that structured input is essential for grammar learning, that language production can hurt an early second language learner, and they really favor comprehension-based instruction. There's also another theory I want to point out called the output hypothesis, and it states that meaning-based production activities can lead to learning, and so this theory does see a role for production-based instruction. However, the input-focused theories have really for decades dominated the second language acquisition field. And in fact, you might recognize that from your own classroom experience with foreign languages. So I know that in my own classes, we did a lot of listening, reading, comprehension grammar exercises, watching videos, and not nearly as much speaking the foreign language. Yeah, so to summarize, traditional second language learning accounts really state that for learning, especially the grammar of a second language, comprehension practice is better than production practice. This question about efficacy of production versus comprehension-based instruction has been a major research question in second language acquisition, so much so that there are by now meta-analyses on this topic. And these meta-analyses found that overall, if you're interested in comprehension performance after learning, comprehension training is more effective than production training. And if you care more about production skills at the end of learning, production-based learning is more effective than comprehension-based training. So a more contemporary conclusion from the second language acquisition literature is that there's limited transfer between learning modalities. And this fits with, for example, cognitive psychology research showing that even in non-language tasks, there is often limited transfer between different tasks. So now that we've reviewed some of the second language acquisition literature, let's turn to the psychology literature, which has more evidence to support the benefits of learning by doing or production. So here's some research in cognitive psychology that I think hints that production might be helpful. So first of all, there's this really interesting research showing evidence that the sounds that an infant can produce versus sounds that they don't know yet how to produce in their developing motor system stand out in the input and are processed differently because of the richer motor processing associated with those sounds that they themselves know how to produce. Then in first language acquisition, there's been a really big focus on quality and quantity of the input that children receive in their environment. So this is research like the 30 million word gap. However, recent research actually points to the number of conversational turns as an even better predictor for language learning outcomes. And critically, a conversational turn involves the child also producing. Then there's some cool research from Belgium, where just like in the Netherlands and many other countries, children are exposed to English long before they ever acquire it in school in a formal classroom setting. And these researchers surveyed which types of naturalistic language experience best predicted skill when the kids are coming into the classroom. And they found that naturalistic experience that affords production, that affords speaking the language. So this is things like posting on social media, gaming, in which people are often talking with other gamers in English, that these really led to better English skills than experiences that only afford comprehension. So things like watching movies or reading books in English. And then finally, and this final research is in college students, but when people practice spelling really difficult words, they actually get faster at reading those same words. So again, pointing to a form of production as being highly beneficial. And actually, thinking back to the laundry folding video, it's not hard for us, for me at least, to believe that practicing something yourself makes you better at doing that. But what we're starting to see here is even some hints that go a step further, that show that practice producing something might actually not just improve production itself, but might also improve comprehension. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to memory research to think a little bit about why production might improve learning. So from the memory literature, there's some evidence that hints that production experience might constitute a stronger learning experience than comprehension. These things they're using different words in this literature, but I'm going to show you the parallels. So when you speak, it requires more attention than when you're just listening. So this increased attention might improve learning. Then when you're speaking, it involves making task-relevant choices about what to say, and making those types of task-relevant choices has been shown, at least in non-language domains, to improve learning. When you speak, you also hear yourself talk, which adds extra listening experience. And this is known as the production effect. So when memorizing word lists, people remember words that they say out loud better. Then production involves recalling words from memory, whereas in comprehension, you only have to recognize what is said. So this is known as the testing effect or retrieval-based learning. And it's been shown that when learning new words, recall practice leads to better learning than recognition practice. However, these memory effects are all focused at the single word level. And while this is relevant, language processing goes way beyond the individual word level, because language involves dependencies between words. And here we do want to specifically investigate the role of production in sentence level learning. So let's think a bit about what happens during language production when we're generating the language ourselves. So when we're speaking, we're mapping a message to an utterance by means of an utterance plan. The steps I'm outlining here are roughly based on the Levelt model of speech production, if you happen to know that. But we're actually fairly agnostic about the specific representations involved here. Just think of it as a shorthand for planning with hierarchical and sequential structure going on. And so while we have all of these different elements of the utterance in working memory during utterance planning, we think that binding can happen between all of these different components of the to be produced utterance. And we think that this binding can strengthen the learning of the dependencies between these different elements. So we think because of this, production processes could yield improved grammatical learning beyond any boost to the learning of individual vocabulary words. Now let's think about comprehension, on the other hand, which involves recognition, where we map from the utterance to the message. But rather than thinking of comprehension as involving all of these same detailed representations, comprehenders might actually just settle for a good enough interpretation without a detailed analysis of all of the syntactic dependencies, especially early on in second language learning. Okay, so to summarize, we've gone from second language acquisition research suggesting that comprehension is a stronger learning experience than production, and accounts saying that there's limited transfer, to psychology research hinting that production might actually be helpful for comprehension, and reasons for why production might improve not just word learning, but grammar learning as well. So that leads us to the following two predictions. First, for learning the grammar of a second language, we do think that production might be a stronger learning experience in contrast with those SLA theories. And then second, and this is in contrast to some of that research showing limited transfer, we also think that this learning might transfer to comprehension. So in order to test these predictions, we first asked whether language production practice can lead to the better understanding of a grammar of a second language than comprehension practice. Then since production is relatively impractical to implement in a classroom compared to comprehension type exercises, especially for all students at the same time, we also asked how much production practice is needed in a comprehension focused curriculum to reap the benefits of this stronger learning experience that we think production constitutes. And then finally, we also wanted to know whether this advantage for learning through production would generalize from the psychology lab to the second language classroom with a natural language. So I'm first going to talk about these two 2018 studies, which use an identical method. And both of these studies are a collaboration with my professor, Mary Ellen McDonald. Okay, so in order to test the role of production in improving grammar comprehension, we taught participants a small artificial language describing a visual world of aliens. The artificial language has several different word types, 4 of which get suffixes marking 2 different grammatical features, number and semantic type. The training that these participants got was fully auditory. They never saw the language written out in the experiment. Okay, so I'm gonna talk through the way training was set up. And we wanted people in both different conditions, the comprehension condition and production condition, to have learning experiences that are as similar as possible. So both groups get passive experience as well as active learning experience. All participants start learning the words in a passive exposure task where they see a picture, hear the phrase to describe it in the artificial language. And this is exactly the same for both conditions. For people in the comprehension condition, the active learning task is to make a match-mismatch judgment. So they hear a picture, they see a picture, they hear a phrase, and then they have to make a match-mismatch judgment to say whether the phrase and the picture match or not. And in half of the trials, it does match, the other half it doesn't. After this, they get feedback in the form of the correct picture audio pairing. Producers, on the other hand, get a picture and they just have to name the picture. And they too get feedback in the form of the correct audio visual pairing. So the first phases of these active learning tasks are different. The second phase is exactly the same, but it's important to note that we actually balance these two tasks to control for some of the known differences between comprehension and production that we're less interested in testing. So in order to control for attention, both sets of participants have an active task where they're making task relevant choices, which we know can lead to learning. And we also control for listening experience, because while production participants hear their own utterances, which may or may not be correct, comprehension participants also hear a phrase which may or may not be correct. Okay, so that's the way training is balanced between the conditions. Then we also had a third condition. We call this a mixed condition, and participants in that condition, for every block of 6 training trials, they get 5 randomly chosen comprehension trials and 1 randomly chosen active production trial. So you'll notice here that I placed the mixed condition a lot closer to the comprehension condition. And that's because the ratio of comprehension to production really is much closer to comprehension learning. So why did we choose this 5-to-1 ratio? First of all, we think that in real life learning situations, it's likely that a learner gets more chances to listen than to speak. Second, we're also interested in seeing how much of a boost even a little bit of production practice might make in the way that people are learning the language. So to recap, we're testing at the same time both the most extreme production versus comprehension contrast by comparing the comprehension only and the production only condition, and as well as a more realistic situation in which there's a mix. Okay, so how does training work? Participants start with simple line drawings of aliens, and they start with passive exposure. This is followed by active practice with this same set of line drawings. Then, can you still see my screen okay? Okay, good. Zoom gave me a notification. Okay, then we throw in plurals, again, first with passive, then with active exposure. After this, plural and singular are always balanced. Then we introduce people to color vocabulary, first on its own, then as part of longer phrases. Then we introduce patterns, first as single words, then as part of longer phrases. Then we introduce alien landscapes, and finally we get full sentences. And this training takes about 45 minutes in total, and I'm going to show you what a full sentence in this alien language looks like.
Vok, Sefok, Magok, Chag, At, Zevok, Hullum.
All right, here's that sentence written out. That's just for you. Participants never saw this written out. And in green here, you see the suffixes highlighted that I mentioned earlier. So the dependencies that are present here, there's both an adjacent dependency. So you can see that these suffixes are present on all the words in the noun phrase. And there's a non-adjacent dependency because there's a suffix on the verb with some interspersing words. Then these suffixes encode, semantic category. So this is a nice monster, which we use the suffix us for, whereas for a scary monster, the suffix would be oak. Then we also have number agreement. So if it's just one monster, it's oak, but if it's 2 of them, it's oko. So that's how our suffixes encode for number. Okay, so after this training, we had several different comprehension tests because we're interested in testing the effect of production training on comprehension performance afterwards. And what I want to emphasize here is that the training is the only part of the experiment that was different for participants in these 3 different between subjects condition. After training, all of these comprehension tests that participants did are exactly the same between conditions. And of course, the reason we test comprehension performance at the end is that we want to not just show that production is a stronger learning experience, but that this transfers to comprehension performance. So the first test we did after learning was a screening test to see if participants had learned the individual vocabulary words. Based on piloting, we set the threshold to be 80% correct, and most participants in all conditions met that. No significant differences between conditions in the percentage of learners that met that threshold, and the pattern of results is the same if we include all learners. So the results I'm going to show you today are just these people who passed the threshold. Then the test of interest included both some first choice comprehension measures as well as some error measuring tests. And I'm going to start by showing you the results from a vocabulary and phrases test. So that test looked like this, where participants saw two pictures that only differed in one property described by a single vocabulary word. So in this example, the word tra, describing the curvy markings on the left here. So our thinking here was that on top of testing single word vocabulary understanding, we wanted to test understanding of the words when you hear them in a sentence. Because if you're hearing a sentence and you're struggling to understand the individual words in there, that might really affect your ability to comprehend the grammatical dependencies between the words. So going to the results, I'm plotting accuracy on the y-axis. I've got my 3 learning groups on the x-axis. And remember that we trained people to ceiling with that screening threshold test on single word understanding. So we're expecting people to do equally well on this. And that's exactly what we find. No differences between conditions here. What we do see, however, is a wide range of individual differences in how well people understand these vocabulary words as part of longer phrases. And you might imagine that these individual differences in vocabulary understanding might affect how well people are able to comprehend the dependencies between the different words, like the suffixes that the words take. So what we do is we use an individual score on this vocabulary and phrases test as a covariate in all other tests I'm going to show you in the rest of the experiment. So for this participant, that covariate would just be 0.5. For this participant, it would be 1. And for this participant, it might be like 0.78. And we do that because we want to control for individual differences and be able to draw conclusions about group differences without worrying about individual differences in vocabulary understanding. All right, so with that, we'll look at our first test that actually tests the understanding of the grammatical dependencies. So this was again a first choice test where people hear a fragment and they have to choose which of the 2 pictures it describes.
Voko, famoko, wimoko, chag, at.
So if you know what these suffixes mean, you should be faster and more accurate to pick out the correct picture. In this case, the 2 aliens on the right. So our dependent variables here are accuracy and reaction time. Okay, so we'll start with looking at accuracy. I've got proportion correct on the y-axis again, and my 3 groups on the x-axis. And our prediction here is that production experience during training will help you understand the suffixes better. So higher accuracy here for the production condition, which is exactly what we find. People in the production condition are significantly more accurate than people in the comprehension only condition. The mixed experience condition, they're better at some item types, but not others than the comprehension participants. Then we also looked at speed, so reaction time. I'm plotting reaction time on the y-axis. And again, we predict that production experience will help you also be faster at understanding what a suffix means. So lower reaction times for the production condition. And that's exactly what we find. So participants in the production condition are significantly faster on this comprehension test than participants in the comprehension condition. And participants in the mixed condition with just a little bit of production practice interspersed with a mostly comprehension focused training are also marginally faster than comprehension only participants. So we've seen evidence that production participants are faster and more accurate. Now I'll move on to the error monitoring test. We tested both suffix agreement errors and word order errors, but I'm gonna focus on the suffix agreement errors since those test the dependency of interest. So in this test, we want to see if people are aware that all 4 suffixes in the sentence have to agree with each other. And the way that this test works is people listen to sentences and they have to judge whether the sentence is grammatical or not without seeing a picture on the screen that the sentence refers to.
Vok, famok, zautoko, stam, at, pavok, creedle.
So in this example, the suffix on the noun doesn't agree with the other words in the sentence. And note that this is just one example sentence. There's many different types of sentences in this test, including correct sentences and sentences with word order errors. So participants couldn't just like learn to only listen for the suffixes to do well at this test. And our thought for this particular trial is that if you're better at understanding the suffix agreement, you should be faster and more accurate at indicating that this sentence contains an error. So again, our dependent variables are accuracy and reaction time. We'll start by looking at accuracy at the top here with proportion correct on the y-axis and the 3 learning conditions. And again, we predict that speaking the language during learning will give participants an advantage in catching these agreement errors, which is exactly what we find. Participants in the production condition are significantly more accurate here, as are participants who got just a little bit of production practice, but mainly comprehension practice. We also looked at speed again, so reaction time on the y-axis. And again, that same prediction that producing during learning will make you faster at catching these agreement errors, which again is what we find. So both the production only condition and the mixed experience condition are significantly faster than the comprehension only condition. So we find evidence that production participants are faster and more accurate than comprehension participants on several different comprehension tests, and that even mixing in a few production trials into a comprehension-focused training provides a significant learning boost. So to answer my first research question, I hope I've convinced you that yes, production practice does in fact improve comprehension, showing both that production is a stronger learning experience, but also that this learning then transfers to comprehension. Then, and I think this is particularly good news for second language learners, I've also shown you evidence that even adding a little bit of production practice to a comprehension-focused training can already provide a boost in learning. So of course, as a starting point, these first studies were done in really controlled settings with an artificial language with a really transparent morphosyntactic dependency. So next, I wanted to know whether we could also find these production benefits in natural language learning. So this next and final study that I'm going to present to you is a collaboration with Valerie Kepenne and Carrie Jackson, both of who are in the German department at Penn State University. And they pointed out to me that, first of all, that not all lab-based artificial language learning studies replicate when you try them with natural languages in a classroom setting. And also that the suffix agreement in my artificial language was much more transparent than most natural languages. So in order to address those two concerns, we decided to reuse that same balanced comprehension versus production training paradigm that I developed, but use it to teach people German grammatical gender agreement instead of an artificial language. Okay, so I don't know who all of you are familiar with German. I see some smiles. So German gender assignment is complex and probabilistic. So whether a word is masculine, feminine, or neuter, it's really hard to know on the surface level. So here's 3 examples of nouns. Der Becher, which is the cup, it's masculine. Die Tasche, the bag, is feminine. And das Fahrrad, the bike, is neuter. Then we can throw in adjectives. We can also look at what happens to this if you go to indefinite articles. So if you wanted to say a cup or a bike, and throw in adjectives again. And what you can see is that German grammatical gender agreement is really hard to learn in a second language. And having tried so myself in high school, I can attest to this. And we even know from other research with languages that have complicated grammatical gender like this, that this is really hard to get right in the moment, even for very advanced second language learners. Okay, so in this study, our participants are first semester second language learners of German in week 4 of their semester. These are our participants. Unfortunately, so we started with balanced numbers in both groups, but we had to exclude people who didn't finish the experiment. There were some coding errors, and there were 4 participants who had either middle or high school German experience or had spent time in a German-speaking country. And most of those people happened to be in the production condition. That being said, there's no differences in the people whose results we do analyze in self-rated German proficiency. So here is again an overview of the training tasks. A difference with the previous experiment is that we also offered people the written form of the language in this experiment. So again, we started people with passive exposure. The active comprehension task was the same. Feedback was the same. Active production task was almost the same. It actually included a hint in the form of the first letter of the article that we targeted, so that people would know whether or not they were meant to do the or a definite or an indefinite article. However, my collaborators actually had some skepticism about the comprehension task that we were employing, because comprehension-focused theories in second language acquisition really emphasize exercises that force the comprehender to process the grammatical dependency. And they weren't sure whether this task was doing that. So if you look at this trial in more detail, you can see that on the word D, that's a grammatical marker. So if you know that Becher is a der word, that might help you click no here. But there's also the noun itself, Tasche. And as a native English speaker, or basically any speaker who's not a native speaker of German, you're always going to wait to hear the noun to make a decision like this, because it's much easier to do so. And even if, so there's 2 cues here, but we think that people might just be using the vocab cue. And even if we make this phrase longer and people have all of this grammatical information, they might still just be waiting for the simple vocabulary cue. So what we decided to do here is introduce a new type of trial. The phrase here, die blaue gepunktete, you would translate it into English as the blue spotted one. So it doesn't have a noun, and this is perfectly legal in German to do this. So this new type of sentence without the noun only has the grammatical cue to disambiguate whether this sentence could or could not correctly be referring to this picture. So we did this so that we for sure had a comprehension task that forces the learner to process the grammatical dependency. Okay, and then of course training was built up in the same way, where participants sort of are iterated through passive and active exposure based on their condition. Of course, we also had sentences like this without the nouns in production trials and in passive trials, just like everything else people learned. So here's what this training looked like. We again start with simple line drawings, passive exposure, then active training. Then we go to indefinite articles, passive and active, color vocabulary integrated into the sentence, pattern vocabulary integrated into the sentence. These two sets of words were cognates on purpose, by the way, because we wanted them to be easy for people to learn. People hadn't learned any of these nouns yet at this point in the semester. Then we had our special grammar focusing sentences without the noun. We had a block of those, both passive and active. Then we introduced a location phrase, so is standing next to the radio. Then we had full sentences, both passive and active training. And then we also had these full sentences, but then again without the nouns. So to help people focus on and learn about the grammar. So here's an overview of the study as a whole. We just talked about training, again, 2 between subjects conditions. Then we had first choice comprehension measures and error monitoring measures again. But then in this study, since most second language acquisition studies that compare production-based and comprehension-based instruction also include production tests at the end, we also included a production test at the end here. I'm not going to discuss those results, but feel free to ask me about them afterwards. So we had 2 first choice comprehension measures, one testing whether people knew the nouns and one testing the gender agreement. So this is what a first choice trial looked like that's targeting noun understanding. So in this case, if you know that Becher is the cup, you can get this trial correct. Unlike in the previous experiment, the phrase wasn't presented auditorily. It was only presented written on the screen, and it just all appeared at once. That has to do with some technical constraints in the German department at Penn State. But because of this, we don't really have accurate reaction times as you can get when you know exactly how the sentence is unfolding to a participant in our previous experiment. This is the second trial type, and this is a trial type of interest. In this case, we again have that phrase without the noun, so the blue spotted. But if you know that Becher is masculine and Kerze, candle, is feminine, you know that this can only refer to the picture on the left. So the only way to get these trials correct is to use the grammatical gender agreement. Okay. So I'm plotting accuracy on the y-axis here, my 2 groups on the x-axis, and I'll start with the results for the noun trials. And again, as we had hoped, people in both conditions are at ceiling here for understanding the meanings of the nouns. Then for the grammar trials, you can see that performance is a lot more variable. However, production participants are on average significantly better at getting these trials correct than comprehension trained participants. So they're better at understanding gender agreement. All right, so we've replicated it. We've replicated our previous finding, at least on the first choice test. Now let's go to the error monitoring test. Again, it's a bit different than in the previous experiment. So there's a picture here, and the sentence is again just written out. And I want to get some hands from the audience here. If you're not on video, feel free to just use the reaction buttons at the bottom. Who thinks that the sentence is grammatically correct in German? And maybe don't respond if you're a native German speaker, but second language learners of German can raise their hands. Okay, I see some hands, thank you. And then who thinks that these, that this particular sentence is not grammatically correct? Can I see some hands for that? Who thinks that it's not grammatical, this sentence? Okay, I'm not seeing any reactions here. So actually, this sentence is not grammatically correct. And this type of trial is really hard for native English speakers because all of these words end in ER, right? Like der, blauer, gepunkteter, Becher. This looks really attractive if you're not a native speaker of German. But actually these 2 R's on the adjective shouldn't be there. Okay, so let's go to the results for this error monitoring test. Accuracy on the y-axis, and we'll start with people's performance on correct sentences. So sentences that were grammatically correct. Then errors in the article, people find those a bit harder. And then this is the example sentence that I gave you. And you can see that people find this really, really hard. What we do see, however, is that production participants do better on average than comprehension participants on all sentence types, and we find marginal differences here in the deep prime scores. So yeah, again, we find in this experiment that production participants are better at understanding gender in several different comprehension tests. So to answer our research question of whether these production benefits generalize to classroom learners of a more difficult grammatical construction is a resounding yes. And I'm really happy because these results got published earlier this year in Applied Psycholinguistics. So I hope I've convinced you through evidence from a series of studies that language production practice might indeed be a stronger grammar learning experience than language comprehension practice, and also that this improved learning does transfer to comprehension. So you might remember, though, that these predictions were in direct contrast with some of that earlier second language research, and I want to come back to that. Because our finding that production is a stronger learning experience is directly opposite to these traditional second language learning accounts. And there were also these findings about limited transfer, whereas we do show transfer from production learning to comprehension performance. So how can we reconcile all of this? Let's first think a little bit about the types of comprehension tasks typically used in second language learning literature. So it's important to note that comprehension tasks need to involve meaning-based processing that necessitates grammatical processing. And we ourselves don't actually necessarily think that all comprehension situations for second language learners really do involve grammatical processing. We actually think there might be a lot of good enough processing going on. Despite that, though, even in our German experiment where we, oh yeah, Axel, do you want to ask a question right now or do you want to wait till the end?
Oh, finished.
Okay,
Sorry.
yeah, I'm almost done. 2 or 3 minutes, I think. Okay, so in our German experiment, we actually introduced those specific grammar focusing trials. So we had that meaning-based comprehension that necessitated grammatical processing, and we still found an advantage for production learning. So we don't think the problem is with comprehension tasks. However, so we'll look at production tasks used. In many second language acquisition studies, and this includes a lot of the studies that this meta-analysis was drawing on, production is instantiated in really shallow ways. So things like repeating a teacher, reading out loud, and so on. And in fact, there's a recent second language acquisition meta-analysis that, no, not meta-analysis, a review article that points out that it's specifically meaning-based production instruction that does find beneficial effects of production learning. There's just not a ton of this meaning-based production research in the second language acquisition literature as of yet. And importantly, the production tasks we used in our experiment, they really involved free production. So people saw a picture, had to come up with words themselves to describe it from memory. And if you remember my cartoon drawing of the dog with the spots, it's that generating the language from memory where we think the learning happens. So that being said, we're not arguing that learners shouldn't do any comprehension exercises or that they can't learn anything from them. We're just arguing for more balanced theories of second language acquisition that do justice to the potentially powerful learning experience that talking in the classroom can be under the right circumstances. So I want to zoom out of language learning a little bit more again and come back to learning more broadly, because second language grammar learning is not the only place where practice doing something can make you better at understanding it too. So here's some examples from the literature that I think are in line with my research. There's evidence from Tanya Lombroso's work that explaining out loud actually helps you become better at seeing category differences. There's also, any of you who teach might have heard of active learning as an evidence-based pedagogy strategy. And active learning activities in the classroom actually do often involve production activities like speaking out loud and writing. And this has been shown to increase understanding of course materials. And then finally, of course, doing is not unique to language. So there's some really fascinating research from Judy Phan's lab. And she shows that drawing, so producing pictures, can make you a better object categorizer, a better object recognizer. And I think all of these broader research findings are examples of when producing is more helpful than comprehending, or doing is more helpful than watching others do things, but also examples of where doing or producing can make you better at comprehending. So going back to our laundry folding example, the equivalent would be that after Ellen gets this hands-on practice with Marie Kondo's folding technique, she's also going to understand it better, what Marie is doing, when she's watching Marie do something really complicated, like folding a fitted sheet. Yeah, so I'd like to thank my co-authors on the studies I've presented to you today, as well as our funders. I would also like to thank everyone who's helped with this research, and thank you all so much for your time and attention. I'm really eager to hear what you thought of this research, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Elise, so much. That was so fascinating. Very interesting work. As you know, I'll have to run right now. I have noted a lot of comments that I can send you later.
Yeah, please.
But now I need to go because I have to have another talk in a couple of minutes, and I'll leave you guys with Elise. If you have questions, she's now in charge of the room. All right, see you later.
I look forward to hearing your comments through email. And then Axel, I saw that you had raised your hand.
Yes, I have a quick silly question.
Yeah.
How do you ensure, how do you disentangle between I mean, in production, you obviously start by just reading the sentence in your material before producing, I guess. And so there is a part of reading which involves at some points perception or processing and so on. How do you ensure that? I know that you're not like prodding one above the other, like only production. But, I mean, how can you be sure that this effect cannot be due to partly, at least, perception as well, and just coupling the link between perception and production?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah. So I just closed my slides, but I'm going to pull them up again.
I'm not really sure it makes sense in the sense that it doesn't, it removes nothing from your effect. Like, I mean, your production data is way above, significantly above the comprehension process. So there is obviously something about production, and I don't deny it. I'm just,
okay.
I just feel like your third condition, where you mix production and perception, is already handled by the production, so to speak.
Oh, okay. Yep. Okay. So yeah, and actually it's interesting that you point this out, because the very first design of this study actually, instead of having like the passive and the active training, and then having the active training split up in active comprehension and active production, the very first design was actually to have the passive comprehension just be the comprehension condition, and then to have the active production in contrast with that. And the reason we didn't do that was that we figured if you contrast this passive learning here with this active production, you know, it basically the difference between could be due to the difference between comprehension and production, but it could also be due to any number of things, like the fact that you're paying more attention because you're doing an active task and you're making these relevant choices and you're hearing your own productions. So that's sort of why we wanted to make the conditions as equivalent as possible by having these two balanced active learning tasks there, so that we could really be able to say, well, any difference in the results is due to this difference. You're absolutely right that like this passive task is a comprehension-like task. Yeah, like as you said, you know, if I'm learning a foreign language, there's no way I'm speaking it before I've ever had any input. So in some ways, input always comes first and has to come first. So even if you think about like babies learning their native language, they also get a lot of comprehension experience before they even start babbling, or perception experience before they even start babbling. So in a lot of ways, I don't know, I tend to think of it as a feature, not a bug, because I tend to think that this is realistic for what language learning is like. And I do think it is important to contrast production with, you know, an active comprehension task that is balanced in all these different ways. Because in the second language acquisition literature, things are actually balanced in the opposite way. So here, if we had compared our active production task with this really like shallow comprehension task where people are just getting the exposure, but they don't have any task at all, I would say that that's imbalanced as a cognitive psychologist. But actually in the second language acquisition literature, there is a lot of that. When people compare production-based versus comprehension-based instruction, they'll compare sort of these really deep comprehension tasks that involve this grammatical processing where people really have to like analyze the structure and break things down. And they'll compare it with a super simple production task where like, I just get some language and I have to read it out loud, but I'm not doing any processing at all. So I'm just practicing my motor, my way of pronouncing the second language, but I'm not doing any of the processing. And so also because of that, it was really important for us that we balance the two tasks. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. Okay, you hear me, right? Yeah. I think yeah, you pointed the right right cues for me to get the big picture. Yeah, thank you. I'll have to go as well because I have recordings to make that. Thanks for the talk. It was great. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Axel. Yeah, and I know it's 4 o'clock, so feel free to leave, whoever else has to. Yeah, Flor.
I just wanna wave goodbye. I have to go as well, but thank you very much. Thank
you, bye-bye. Thanks, Kubra. Any other questions before we wrap up? And feel free to email me questions as well. All right, if not, then I'm gonna end the recording and the meeting. Thank you, everyone.